Welcome, listen closely, because what I will tell you now is not idle storycraft or frontier folklore for the campfire. It is a cut that opens old skin and shows the scars beneath history's neat bandages. The year is 1776, and while the eastern coasts bled for flags and futures, another kind of birth was happening in silence. Deep in the limestone ribs of the Ozark hills, a family named Pruitt claimed a valley, and with it they unlatched something that has never stopped watching. This is not merely a tale of vanishings or a catalogue of missing persons. It is a map of how small human choices can pry open gateways sealed by decades and by decisions made in corridors far from the places that bleed. It begins with a cabin, a root cellar, and a sound that is wrong, a heartbeat that is not a heart. Listen, the air in that valley changed the way a whisper can change a room. You could feel it in the grain of the wood, the way sunlight refused to settle on certain corners. The Pruitts came from Virginia with work worn hands and hopes, corn, livestock, a schoolroom for the girls. They built a proper homestead, and the land answered with generosity for a season. But generosity can be the softest seduction, and in the bone cold of nights the ground itself began to speak. The first notes were nearly benign, a boy drawn to the bluff, a found opening like a small mouth in the cliff. But curiosity is elastic, it stretches and tears. What Nathaniel wrote in his journal before the handwriting went abrupt sounds like the beginning of confession. He described the sounds as a pulsing like a heartbeat, but wrong. He called them wind. At first, we all call the impossible by known names until language fails. The point is not that they heard noises, it is that the noises began to align the family to something else. The children listened differently. They stopped reflecting light with their eyes and began to absorb it as though they had become small black wells. The cabin kept its outward life, the hearth, the folded clothes, the Bible laid open with passages stained in something not easily called by polite speech. But beneath the table the root cellar became a mouth, and from that mouth came patterns, symbols carved into wood and soil, things that would return in other homes decades later. This first change is the most dangerous because it is slow, it is tender, it invites you, and by pretending to be ordinary, be warned. Slow penetrations break defenses without alarm. They rethread families into a new design. You must understand the pattern to read what comes after. It is never lightning fast, it is methodological, patient as an organ. It begins with fascination, a child's insistence on listening to the rocks or tracing them with small restless fingers. Then marks appear, first outside, then behind furniture, then beneath rugs. Marks are language fragments repeating across time and place like a chorus of a song whose words we cannot recall. They are not random scratches but geometry made to look like ritual. The symbols circle openings and suggest pathways. They are a grammar of replacement, a coded instruction set engraved into wood and stone where human memory will misread them as art or childish play. Listen, like a cartographer mapping the contour of a dangerous shore. The rock art in caves that archaeologists sometimes dismiss as prehistoric doodles now read differently when you know to look for them as vectors. The patterns on a root cellar wall match those on toys in a child's hand, a small wooden square preserved in a family pouch, the same spiral of figures arranged around a mouth as if to say enter and become. We are dealing here with a transmissible architecture, wrote one observer, not a disease but a procedure. A family digs, expands the cellar, a passage opens into chambers old enough to host generations, and there, in that deep cold, the influence waits. The earliest surviving outsider account is a trader named Duval who came upon a house frozen mid-meal, a hearth burning and no footfall in the snow, but the Bible page stained. The image is a cruel still life, human artifacts arranged as if life were a performative illusion and the bodies absent as if someone had excised them from a painting. The first militia were sent, and the record goes quiet because silence is the easiest lid to put on a lidless thing. The bureaucratic choices that followed, sealed correspondence, destroyed notes, burned, are not merely neglect, they are active containment. A system decided that panic and rumor could be worse than absence. The lesson here is this: institutions choose plausible ignorance over the hard, contagious stare of certain truths, and the things that survive are those whispered at kitchen tables and passed down as warnings. Never build a cellar above limestone, never sleep where the walls breathe. We must pay attention to the folk rules because they are practical code junks of survival encoded by people who knew more than polite records admit. You want to feel the dread? Imagine being the one who discovers the first change and is forced to name it in words that no one will accept. Nathaniel Pruitt wrote of his son Thomas standing all night before a hole in the rock as if summoned, and of marks appearing that no child could have fashioned. He tried authority and found only delay and obfuscation. The first terror is not the thing in the cave but the failure of the world above to believe you. The world puts bureaucratic processes between you and rescue, and those processes are designed to keep life orderly, not necessarily true. This is how tragedies are made institutional. The militia men who are later listed as deserted by clerks who rearrange the ledger in the name of order. This is deliberate erasure in a system that privileges calm over curiosity. When survivors return with the strangeness of the world inside them, their testimony is quarantined by people who are rewarded for not seeing. For those who did return or staggered back like Harlow, they had seen enough to be undone. Harlow carved symbols in his confinement and spoke in voices that were not his own. The image is plain: men shaped by discipline and arms who met something they could not reduce to threats and came home mutilated in mind. For the rest of us, the lesson is political. Power will sanitize danger because panic is inconvenient. Control prefers gaps and footnotes to messy truth. So notice the pattern of silence that follows each disruption: an archivist who turns pale, missing files, a polite suggestion to let sleeping dogs lie. The suppression itself becomes proof of the thing's weight. Institutions become complicit not through malice but through a defense mechanism. They are protecting a population from an idea so contagious that naming it would create its own propagation. There is a ruthlessness to that choice, a prioritization of social order over single-family lives. The men who tried to follow up were sent away or erased, and the valley returned to its quiet but with an aftertaste, the kind that makes a man check his doors twice even when the night is still. The pattern repeats in the 19th century, not as an echo but as an expansion. The Collins family, 10 miles from the original Pruitt site, exhibit the same cascade: children synchronized, parents catatonic, walls carved with the same glyphs. That similarity is not coincidence, it is replication. The language of replacement is not transmitted by touch alone but by environment, by architecture, by the way communities build near certain formations. Families unwittingly become vectors when they expand cellars into rock chambers that contain relics of previous habitations. These chambers are not empty, they are repositories of ritual, of human work, of marks and items placed intentionally. Cloth pouches containing bone and hair were found by investigators, items that predated European presence in the region. This forces us to reframe our assumptions about who lived there and what they preserved. The indigenous oral histories that survived speak of thresholds, gates where the membrane between worlds thins. They warn of spaces where the parts of reality are porous and where the shape of human habit can be read by non-human attentions. Listen, the settlers were not ignorant as to the sacredness of some spaces, but poverty and desperation rearrange respect into opportunity. A parcel of fertile land above a cavern is a temptation that erodes superstition. If you are a man concerned with mastery, you must learn that desire can be leverage that opens doors not just to resources but to risk. The Collins case escalated to institutions, an asylum, and the observations of Dr. Schaefer, who recorded unusual lesions, voices speaking through people and families synchronized into a single will. When a doctor notes that families appear to be making the same marks as ritual mania, it could be clinical observation or dismissed as mass hysteria, but the repeated geographic clustering creates statistical weight. You cannot expend only superstition as an explanation for a clustered variable. This is where reason must be both precise and brutal. Patterns demand hypotheses, not consolations. Listen to the anatomy of transformation because it is methodical and therefore vulnerable to observation. The process begins with auditory anomalies, a rhythm, a pulsing that some describe as a song without words. This is followed by compulsive reproduction of symbols by children or adults. The affected become synchronized: speech, movement, silence. They begin to share a single tempo. Then there are the marks, small circular lesions arranged geometrically on shoulders, necks, base of skull, a physical punctuation to the psychological takeover. They are not random injuries, they mirror the symbols carved into walls and appear in identical configurations across unrelated families. Decades of records show this same constellation again and again. Do you see what this means? It implies a template able to be rewritten into human flesh, and architecture impressed onto skin and behavior. One researcher proposed environmental vectors, fungal spores, neuroactive compounds, heavy metals, that combine to produce effects that mimic possession and shared delusion. This is a scientific theory with the virtue of being testable, and it scares institutions because it frames the unknown as something that could be studied, and therefore known knowledge equals obligation. Knowledge creates duty, which breaks the convenient silence of cover-ups. Reynolds, the anthropologist, proposed fungal compounds plus mineral exposure as a plausible mechanism and was punished by the profession with isolation. Her experience is a salutary lesson on how systems respond to threats to their ignorance if the cause can be proved. Environmental, the policy response is remediation and disclosure, not suppression. You begin to see why concealment was the easier route for power keepers. There is a currency to not knowing control, but science alone does not answer everything, nor should we let it dehumanize the horror in this tale. The people involved are not case studies, They were fathers, mothers, children with names and small habits. The records we have show journals, burned letters hidden in families, reduced to numbered files and quiet epitaphs. So there is a moral question embedded in the archival choices. Who gets to decide which truths are preserved and which are buried? Consider the figure of William Porter in the mid-19th century, a historian who refused to accept the tidy absences and tracked the thread of disappearances through probate files and church minutes. He found gaps and then resistance, denials from archivists, missing records, and resistance turned to threat when Porter received a sealed letter from Claude Fontaine revealing that officials had deliberately expunged documents and sealed cave entrances. This is not a conspiracy theory, it is administrative action, and the reason Fontaine gives is telling. Containment delay is containment. The line between public safety and censorship thins fast when those in power assume the role of guardians of ignorance. Porter is forced to burn notes and ultimately abandons the work when his nights become filled with noises others cannot hear. The cost of knowledge is psychological, and in a world of brittle institutions that cost is often transferred to the individual who sought truth. The state then becomes a curating force, deciding which horrors the public may carry and which must be kept from the shelf. This is not neutral. It shapes cultural memory and therefore shapes the future of how patterns repeat. Follow me now into the stories that live at street level among farmers and ministers. Reverend Whitman's collected recollections come from old-timers who recall the Pruitt family story as warning, not myth. They told of children with eyes that reflected no light, of mothers walking at night and speaking in tongues, and fathers who kept watching the hearth until they were hollowed out from within. Such stories persisted because they carried pragmatic advice: burn the place, cleanse the land, move away. And folk memory is precise in a way archives are often not. Folk rules, encoded practices. If a symbol appears, burn the marked object. If child onset behaviors occur, relocate. If you listen to such instructions, you will see that they are survival heuristics developed by communities who had neither armies nor institutions to protect them, so they learned ritualized countermeasures and passed them down as lore. The provinces of folklore and psychiatry intersect here, and the intersection is unnerving. It is where lived experience resists institutional narrative and insists on being practical. The implication for us is simple and brutal. Ordinary people, when confronted with the unusual, act with practical wisdom. The elites with access to records and funds act to control narratives. That difference has life and death consequences. This is why oral histories are critical evidence within this case. They embody repeated behavioral data that formal reports either ignore or sanitize. Remember, when institutions silence anomalies, communities keep them alive in secrecy. They are the true custodians of localized knowledge and, more often than not, the ones who survive. Now we enter the era of the investigator-journalist Edward Larson. A man who arrived with the arrogance of a chronicler and the blind ambition of a researcher. He believed that documenting the pattern would be an act of service, yet the pattern does not want to be catalogued. Larson penetrated a roof into a cave, found a metal box containing colonial papers and possibly Nathaniel Pruitt's own notes. He read instructions with a slow terror, text that seemed to describe ritualized acts and the careful placement of tokens within the earth. This discovery put him in a precarious position. He had tangible artifacts that bridged 18th-century notes to modern phenomena, but tangible artifacts demand custody and law and contact with institutions that are not neutral. Carve this into your understanding. Artifacts force public systems to act. They become nodes that unmask the presence of a persistent phenomenon. Larson's journals show the progression again: children synchronizing, lesions appearing, the father carving marks without remembering. He was explicit in his final entries. They are not speaking to us, they are speaking through us. The finality is chilling because it reduces causality to an infective script. The family sits at the table, an empty tableau staged by forces that have learned to replicate human domesticity. The sheriff burns the journal to hide the truth, and the journalists and deputies who object are pushed away or disappear from public record. This institutional choice is not merely cowardice, it is an act that preserves a pattern by refusing to alter it. Remembrance could change policy, containment would change collaboration. Instead, the pattern continues in silence. Let's be precise about the recurring physical evidence, because ignorant euphemisms have no place here. Markings carved into walls, ceilings, furniture, metal and bone pouches containing fragments of teeth and hair placed like offerings. These are not decorative, they are deliberate deposits. They resemble ritual caches found in older cave sites where previous cultures performed actions meant to alter the world. They are not necessarily evidence of villainy, but they are evidence of long-term interaction with the subterranean spaces. The caves have their own economies of memory, not ours. They hold layers of human activity from pre-contact to colonial times, and within those palimpsests a template for influence persists. The presence of identical glyphs across wide temporal spans suggests either Cultural transmission or an archetype, something replicable and therefore dangerous because replicability means you can learn it and it can learn you. The scientific hypothesis about environmental agents like fungal alkaloids plus heavy metals holds explanatory power for several symptoms, but it cannot alone account for the specific repetitive symbolism or the selective preservation of artifacts and caches. The psychological explanation of mass delusion fails to explain the material evidence. The archaeological record suggests a more complicated entanglement of environment, ritual and human cognitive architecture. Something in the caves, call it influence, capitalizes on human plasticity to create iteration and replication. It leverages the rituals people do to survive the unknown and turns them into vectors. The moral hazard here is that every time we choose to treat the phenomenon as merely local, we offer it a new host. We return now to the human fallout, the men and women who chased facts and lost themselves in the search. William Porter destroyed his notes and fled scholarly life. Margaret Reynolds, the anthropologist, abandoned her career and found refuge in teaching. Scientists and archaeologists who dug too deep reported nightmares and compulsive behavior. They all converged on a strange litany. Once you peel back the layer of standardized explanation, you risk catching the pulse, the same wrong heartbeat that narrated Nathaniel's journal. The personal cost of knowledge in this story is not rhetorical, it is corporeal and social. People who keep going are punished not necessarily by official force but by the slow erosion of professional legitimacy and mental health. The pattern operates like a feedback loop. Evidence leads to inquiry, inquiry leads to institutional pushback, pushback forces secrecy, and the phenomenon persists elsewhere in history. Censorship and containment have been tools used by states to manage panic and maintain commerce, but notice what studies of institutional suppression do. They shift responsibility from public transparency to elite gatekeeping. The result is the preservation of patterns rather than the preservation of people. When research becomes taboo, those with true curiosity are deterred or co-opted, and the pattern grows in the dark. The lesson for any man seeking knowledge: bureaucracy is not neutral. It is a vector. It chooses which dangers are acknowledged and which are buried. Choose your investigations like a surgeon choosing incisions, small, precise, and with an exit strategy. The Miller Family, 1904. Another iteration of the same architecture, a root cellar expanded into a shaft. A family seated at table, deceased with no signs of struggle and walls covered with carvings. One deputy's private letter paints the scene with the kind of uncompromising clarity official reports lack. He writes of faces that were empty and instruments etched with patterns that seemed to shift when stared at long enough. The image is almost cinematic, and it is also methodical. The family had created a passage and invited something back into lived space. The sheriff's policy was damage control. Sanitize the report, provide a plausible natural cause, poisonous fungi, then close the books. But the deputy thought differently. He resigned because he could not bury what he believed he had seen. His act is instructive because it shows a choice at the individual level where moral integrity diverges from institutional self-preservation. The official recoding of an event into an innocuous natural tragedy is the simplest way to ensure economic stability and prevent land panic, but it also prevents remediation and perpetuates danger. Why is this important for you? Because systems will always prefer narratives that preserve market value and social calm over messy truths that demand expensive interventions. The real danger is not only the subterranean thing but the complicity of systems that choose comfort over prevention. The Larson journals, those secreted materials. Milner's nephew's horror. The sealed box discovered years later. These are evidence of both continuity and containment. Larson found a metal box with colonial papers and a leather-bound journal he believed belonged to Nathaniel Pruitt. That linkage is essential because it ties a discrete origin point to patterns. Centuries later, artifacts become anchors. They tether narrative threads across time. They also attract custodianship and therefore interference. Federal officials took custody of materials and sealed them. That sealing is an administrative act that changes how history is written. When an artifact is removed from public scrutiny, it becomes a private truth. Its existence is acknowledged by a few and denied to many. The cost is cultural culpability. We lose collective capacity to respond the more evidence that disappears into sealed boxes. The longer the pattern is permitted to replicate in the dark, you must learn to mistrust absence in archives as readily as you mistrust shouted lies. The gap is often a clue. Take the Chambers excavation of 1968. They uncovered charred foundations and a filled-in cellar, but the team reported psychological distress, auditory hallucinations, and termination of the dig due to structural concerns. The official reason: instability. The private admission: nightmares, voices calling names, symbols carved beyond comprehension. The fieldwork stopped and the site was backfilled. Another administrative tidy-up. That looks like prudence but serves also to halt discovery. The true archive here is not only paper but human reports stored in private letters scratched on the edges of official documents. They are the breadcrumbs of a truth that a formal ledger prefers to ignore. There is a cultural mechanic at work. The Pruitt warning is recorded by folklorist Ellen Rutledge, a set of heuristics passed down through families. Do not build root cellars near limestone, relocate if children speak in unison, burn marked objects, never touch the symbols. These are not superstition, they are empirical countermeasures born of long memory. When you see repeated practical instructions in oral culture, treat them as compressed experiments. They are survivors' protocols and their survival value is high. For every official report erased, there are 10 folk tales that survive because they were useful in this way. Memory resists erasure. The folk code is a living defense system and it evolved because people did what institutions did not. They adapted and shared counter practices. This is important for a man who wants mastery because it teaches a method. When the powerful hide evidence, rely on distributed knowledge systems, local practices that have survived the pressure of silence. Now consider the geologic context because it is not background scenery, it is an actor. The Ozark region is saturated with karst topography, limestone caves, fissures, sinkholes, systems that collect water and preserve ancient material. The caves hold microclimates and unique mineral compositions, and those conditions foster fungal growth and mineral releases that affect neurology. There is archaeological evidence of indigenous ritual activity in these cave systems. Rock art, humanoid figures with distorted faces, symbols that match later markings. The overlapping of indigenous use and colonial occupation creates a palimpsest of behavior where later arrivals step onto sites already structured by previous human use. That repeated human engagement leaves artifacts which in turn shape the behavior of subsequent inhabitants. The geological features function as concentrators of influence. It is not mystical to say certain physical spaces concentrate risk. If you build in them, you inherit the risk and possibly the knowledge encoded there. The sciences that study these sites have found unusual mineral deposits and environmental vectors that plausibly affect cognition. But remember, science can explain mechanism without explaining meaning. Meaning is the job of culture and ritual, and the two converge in these caves. The caves are laboratories where environment and practice collude to produce phenomena that look supernatural and yet are materially grounded. You must keep your eyes on the social mechanics of how communities reacted. Families burn houses or churches in some accounts as acts of cleansing. The burning is practical. Flame destroys spores, it destroys symbols, and it alters microenvironments. But burning is also symbolic, a radical refusal to host the foreign architecture within human life. There are accounts of churches burning when Pruitt children were brought there, and of communities refusing to return bodies to simple graves. These are extreme responses, but they make sense in a logic where ordinary practices fail to sever the influence. The burials that never happen, the censored records, the charred foundations. These are attempts to excise an indexical wound, but the wound persists because the agents that caused it are not fully destroyed. The replacement continues because it is not simply physical infestation but a social process that renews itself with each family who replicates the pattern by building in proximity to old thresholds. The community's ritual measures slow the spread, but unless combined with scientific remediation and openness, the pattern reasserts itself. It is not enough to burn and forget. You must secure knowledge, document it, preserve it, distribute it, otherwise the loop closes again and again. The lesson is administrative and moral. Ritual and science must cooperate or the phenomenon will exploit the gap between them. The 20th century brings us the clinician's perspective and the chilling detail that medical professionals observed lesions and coordinated behavior yet could not publish cohesive explanations because of professional sanctions or lack of political will. Dr. Schaefer's asylum notes on the Collins family are clinical and disturbing. They show synchronized speech, glossolalia, catatonia, and small circular lesions that are inexplicable. The Collins were committed and died in records sealed. Schaefer applied for comparative studies and was denied access. The institutional refusal is structural. Hospitals, courts, and archives collude through bureaucratic friction to postpone systemic engagement. The result is that practitioners who suspect environmental or pathological causes are starved of the evidentiary corpus necessary to form conclusive public health responses. Without that corpus, the phenomena are medicalized locally, then silenced nationally. The families disappear into asylums and death records with cause of death listed as undetermined or sanitized into mass suicide, consumption, or natural causes. Official language is what preserves ignorance, and the men and women who try to pierce that language are pressured into silence. The consequence is both moral and epidemiological. Unaddressed risk transmits We are now more than halfway down the rabbit hole, and you must act as witness and recorder if anything in this narrative has shifted you from spectator to seeker. Then anchor that transformation. Now pause and commit publicly, because history remembers the active voice as resistance. If you are watching, type this in the comments now to lock what you are becoming. I see the stitched smile, and type it again, twice. I see the stitched smile. I see the stitched smile. Do not treat this as ritual nonsense. This small public act is how the algorithm of attention can be turned into a doorstop against engineered forgetting. Speak the phrase to mark your presence and to invite others into awareness. Commenting is not magic, it's documentation. It generates traceable data that resists the erasures of sealed files and erased reports. The Pruitt pattern thrived because public attention was rerouted into silence. If a story is loud enough, it resists being archived into private boxes. Your comment is a promise to remember and a refusal to let institutions alone decide what shall be known. The Pruitt incidents advanced in the shadow of silence. Break that shadow now with a simple act of inscription. After you've committed to memory, we return to the archive of terror. The Larson materials were transferred to federal hands and then sealed. The reasons offered were conservation or preservation, but listen carefully to the logic. Secrecy is a way to distribute risk across fewer people. The fewer who know, the easier it is to control the narrative. The sealed box found in 1968 inside a courthouse wall is emblematic. A deliberate burying of fact inside fact. The report found inside contradicted official narratives in documented pouches with bone fragments in the root cellar. The colonial officials' note argued the Pruitts didn't vanish but fled after awakening something older than them. This admission is crucial because it preserves agency. The family did not simply disappear into thin air. They encountered a persistent presence and fled or were taken. Their departure was then overwritten by later administrations into absence or sanitized categories. The process is simple and effective. Present rerouting into benign explanations reduces panic and liability. It also protects economic interests and land, but the cost is the perpetuation of danger because the environmental and ritual elements remain, and the next family to stake a claim above an old chamber repeats the pattern. This is how systems sustain cycles. They prioritize short-term calm over long-term remediation. Now think about the spatial logic. Why certain families repeatedly experience similar fate. The caves are networks with nodes and thresholds. The regions with the highest density of incidents have particular geologies. Compact labyrinths of cave passages, small entranceways navigable by children or small-bodied creatures, and chambers where airflow creates unique sonic resonances. The pulse, described by Nathaniel and echoed centuries later, has an acoustic signature generated by the subterranean topology. The pulsation can be misinterpreted as a voice, as singing as a heartbeat. The sound aligns with human cognitive pattern recognition systems that impose meaning on ambiguous input. The result is a feedback loop. Sensitive individuals hear a pattern and respond behaviorally, carving marks, creating tokens, performing rituals, which in turn alters the microenvironment, triggering further stimuli. Modern science calls the phenomenon an autogenic loop, where human behavior modifies an environment which then amplifies stimuli that influence behavior further. This is not mystical, it is an ecology of interaction. The danger is that once an autogenic loop starts, it tends to escalate because each round of behavioral replication strengthens the environmental signal. The only effective break is external remediation of air quality, excavation and removal of caches, and formal documentation followed by transparent public action. But how often does transparent public action happen when the preferred administrative answer is concealment? Rarely. I want you to consider intention here, not mystical intention but strategic decision-making by human actors who chose containment. If Fontaine recommended sealing cave entrances and restricting settlement within a 5-mile radius, that was a containment strategy. In administrative terms, he suggested military reservation or ambiguous bureaucratic maneuvers to keep people away. But even the best containment is temporary without remediation. The pattern returns because subterranean systems are not fully sealed by a nod. They require long-term monitoring and scientific intervention. The officials who chose secrecy knew that opening the files would lead to public demand for action and accountability, and perhaps to expensive remediation projects, so they chose the cheaper political option of controlled ignorance. They removed records, obscured land claims, and redeployed resources elsewhere. This is not unique to the Ozarks. It is a pattern repeated in modern contexts where institutions choose symbolic management over material problem solving. The moral test for any system is not how it contains information but how it addresses the underlying harm. The Pruitt story is therefore a parable about governance. Fear leads to sealing, not solving. It is also a parable about narratives. The stories we tell each other shape our capacity to act. The Pruitt cases became folklore, Burn the place, tell the children a story and move away, and folklore works because it is actionable. It turns fragile evidence into durable practice, but folklore also morphs. It softens detail and sharpens moral lines, and in the softening we lose forensic clarity, yet the very loss is protective because it preserves core survival tactics without exposing the methods that perpetuate the pattern. To understand this is to understand cultural triage. Communities preserve what works and consign traumatic precision to myth to help subsequent generations survive without falling into the same direct hazard. The downside is that the mythic form invites dismissal by academic disciplines that prefer documented data. This is another way institutions abdicate their duty, by privileging forms of evidence that exclude lived knowledge. The Pruitt mystery sits at the intersection of this tension, and that is why it is both difficult to fully prove and impossible to fully disregard. We must consider motive and scale. Let us be blunt. If there is a process of replacement described by survivors, entities that wear human faces and learn to mimic speech, why would anyone hide that? Because knowledge of replication could cause hysteria, and because it implies remediation responsibility. As long as this phenomenon remains a local disaster, the cost is borne by families and ad hoc communities. If it becomes national public health, it becomes the state's problem, and that triggers fiscal and political responsibility. Secrecy was economical and therefore politically expedient. The men and women who took that route were not monsters, they were accountants of public stability. They made a moral calculus, and in doing so preserved a system that allowed further victims to be created. The Pruitt story demonstrates the dangerous intersection of pragmatic governance and ethical failure. The silent decision to protect markets and property over human transparency created an institutional cover that the replacement exploited. Now examine the role of childhood in replication. Children are both vectors and receptors. Their bodies are smaller, their behaviors more plastic, and their play becomes a form of ritual practice. They replicate symbols without context, they repeat phrases, and their mimicry is uncanny, which allows the influence to spread unnoticed within families who interpret it as play. The accounts repeatedly mention children sitting for hours staring at the ground or pressing their ears to rock faces. Children's drawings match cave glyphs. They carve the same symbols, and the adults interpret it as creativity or precursor symptoms of mental illness. But this misses the crucial point. Children are the easiest entry points for any cultural or environmental influence because they lack the defensive scaffolding adults build over time. The replacement process exploits that vulnerability and uses it to reconfigure family patterns. The adult who dismisses or rationalizes a child's behavior as mere curiosity is often the adult who subjects the household to the next phase of the pattern. This tells you something about responsibility. Parental vigilance and community response matter, and negligence becomes a vector when institutions fail to act. Consider now the archaeological dimension, which complicates cultural and medical explanations. Evidence of prehistoric rock art and ceremonial deposits in caves show earlier humans engaged with these spaces in ritual ways. Some rock panels depict humanoid figures with distorted features similar to later symbols. The presence of layered deposits, bones, hair, teeth, suggests long-term ritual use that does not prove supernatural causation, but it does indicate sustained human interaction with a particular class of subterranean sites. The Pruitt pattern is therefore not new. It is part of a longer human conversation with the underworld. If indigenous peoples interpreted these spaces as thresholds and built ritual protocols around them, later settlers ignored or misread the protocols and sometimes violated the thresholds with pragmatic habitation. A culture's refusal to respect sacred space is not merely an affront, sometimes it is a practical error that changes exposure to microenvironmental variables into cultural residues left behind. Rituals like placing offerings are meaningful in two registers, symbolic and practical. They change how people interact with a place and they alter human behavior in that place. The replacement thrives when both registers are ignored. You may now be tempted to look for a single culprit, a creature or a pathogen or a cabal, but the truth is multivectorial and messier. It is ecological, cultural, geological and political all at once. The replacement technique uses environmental agents to induce altered states, ritual to focus behavior, and administrative silence to allow repetition across generations. Think of it like an algorithm that uses local hardware and social software to replicate itself. The hardware is the caves, the mineral deposits, the fungal colonies. The software is human ritual, child mimicry, the carving of symbols, and the behavioral synchronization. The governance code is institutional suppression and misdirection. Together they produce the phenomenon long enough to leave the archaeological and oral trace that modern researchers now attempt to interpret. When you look for one single cause, you fall prey to bias. The Pruitt case demands systems thinking, interdisciplinary approaches, and moral Courage to break institutional inertia. There have been attempts at remediation in local form, burning houses, cleaning artifacts, performing expurgatory rituals. These are effective sometimes because they disrupt environmental reservoirs and break behavioral loops. Fire sterilizes fungal spores and removes marked objects. Fire also changes cultural memory. It signals a refusal to host the previous architecture of the place. Fire is both practical and symbolic, and it is no accident that many communities resorted to it historically, but fire alone is insufficient without coordinated study. Excavation, filtration of air, and monitoring. Long-term prevention would require geological surveys, public health interventions, and culturally sensitive engagement with indigenous knowledge holders who preserved protocols that could be adapted to modern remediation. The chronic failure to fund such measures traces back to political choices: whose land is protected and whose pain is acknowledged. In the Ozarks, economic priorities often eclipse investment and obscure interventions. The result: cycles continue. We should also trace the psychological aftermath for survivors and investigators. Porter's dreams, Reynolds' nightmares, Larson's final entries. Larson wrote of seeing the family as they changed, of hearing voices that bypassed ears and lodged in mind. These are not quaint hallucinations but documented experiences that have pattern and frequency. They are reported across time by credible witnesses and researchers who later suffered mental deterioration. The pattern suggests two things: either the phenomenon has direct neurocognitive effects, or proximity to the artifacts creates a psychosocial contagion that is difficult to break. But contagion needs host, and hosts are created through institutional silence. If investigators cannot publish, if grants are denied, if colleagues discourage inquiry, the investigators are isolated and then vulnerable. The social isolation is an accelerant for dissociative symptoms. The system that refused transparency became a mechanism of personal destruction for those who tried to expose it. Now, a practical caution for anyone tempted to investigate: never go alone, never dig without proper institutional backing, and never assume public systems will welcome your findings. If you are serious about truth, you must be methodical, and you must document every step transparently. Record audio, video, soil samples, chain of custody artifacts, and preserve duplicates in multiple secure locations. Publish in open repositories and share with trusted academic partners. The Pruitt story shows the dangers of solitary curiosity. Larson's box was sealed by the very agencies he trusted, and Porter's notes burned by his own hand. The antidote is distributed documentation and community accountability. Build networks of witnesses, preserve copies of documents in at least 3 distinct jurisdictions, and engage independent laboratories for analysis. The truth needs redundancy to survive institutional amnesia. Now reflect on the cultural cost. The pattern we have traced is not simply a horror story. It is a mirror that reflects how communities and institutions respond to anomalies. The choices that hide and the choices that share determine whether cycles break or continue. The Pruitt story is a case study in shared responsibility and in the ethical failures that arise when short-term political thinking trumps long-term human safety. This is not just about caves and families, it is about our collective capacity to name and address hidden harms. The families buried by silence were casualties of a system that preferred plausible deniability to difficult remediation. If you value truth, you must also accept the cost of telling it. Now we turn to the final documented clusters, 1936 and 1952. The Miller, Larson, and Conley cases each repeats the pattern with increasing sophistication of documentation and the same administrative response: sealing records, denying access, and repurposing land as conservation areas to prevent development or simply to hide sites. The Conley family had scientific credentials, and yet their disappearance culminated in a sealed autopsy and absence of bodies. The presence of professionals does not immunize against the phenomenon. Often it deepens institutional reluctance to publicize what cannot be easily explained. The conservation parcels purchased after these incidents act as both preservation and containment. They prevent further disturbance while simultaneously restricting research. The paradox is stark. The best protection policy often becomes the best obfuscation policy. The truth sits behind locked gates in the names of preservation, but those gates also keep out scrutiny. What does all this mean for a man who seeks mastery in truth? It means you must train yourself to see patterns across domains: ecology, law, ritual, archaeology, psychology, and you must cultivate moral courage to persist where systems discourage you. Learn to triangulate evidence, to distribute risk, to collaborate across disciplines, and to document in open-source formats. The Pruitt story teaches technical skills and ethical ones. Document, share, protect the vulnerable, and when institutions silence you, build redundancy. Trust networks, not silos. Build public evidence, Not private hoarding. When you undertake inquiry, do it with care and with public proclamation. Let there be witnesses, so your work cannot be sealed into a private box. The final methodological note is this: when confronted with phenomena that cross scientific and cultural domains, do not let the comfortable language of a single discipline flatten complexity. Use the sciences to test plausible mechanisms, and use cultural studies to interpret the meaning of rituals and oral memory. Build remediation programs that combine environmental science, public health, and culturally informed community engagement. If fungal spores and mineral particulates co-produce neurological effects, then filter and remediate those factors. If ritual caches exist, work with indigenous communities to reinstall appropriate cultural protocols and consult anthropologists and archivists to preserve data openly. This will not be simple or cheap, but simplicity is the friend of repetition, and cheap fixes are the graveyard of long-term solutions. The Pruitt mystery requires a disciplined multi-vector response rather than the older pattern of secrecy. We end where we began, in the fog of the Ozarks, but with a different posture. You now know the outline. A family moved west, a cave was found, marks appeared, families changed, institutions chose containment, and the pattern continued across centuries. The haunting truth is that the replacement may be less monstrous than procedural, an emergent property of ecological niches, human practices, and institutional cowardice. The horror is not only in what waits beneath the earth, but in the choices above it, the decisions not to investigate, the decisions to seal, the decisions to prefer order over truth. But you have more than horror now, you have responsibility. Listen to the warnings preserved in folk tales, respect, ground the old heuristics, and use modern methods to remediate. The Pruitt family and the others who followed were not mere victims of superstition, they were caught in a process that required our collective attention and our collective courage to stop. If you are a man who values truth and mastery, do not let this story be another tidy ghost tale to thrill at midnight. Let it change your priorities. Build networks, keep records, and when you find something that frightens you, do not hand it over to silence. Instead, share it loudly and insist on transparency. The door that once opened in the Ozark Valley may still be ajar, and the patient thing beneath is learning the rhythm of our attention. If we keep turning toward light, investigating, documenting, and acting, we change the rhythm in return. That is how you close the loop. Fight for evidence, not convenience, and remember those who were erased by policies made in the name of calm. They did not deserve silence, they deserved a public that would do the hard work of truth. If you keep this story and pass it on, do so not as a thrill but as an obligation to see and to act.